Hello everybody, this is Graeme Anderson, and today I'm going to be looking at Pacific Rails Inc. Now this is a game about building a train network across the United States from East Coast to West Coast. Each player takes on the role of a railway company vying to become the first to integrate the Transcontinental Railroad. Now we've seen this theme about route building many times before, but luckily it's a theme I actually enjoy. So the theme isn't going to set this game apart, but I'm also not going to hold the theme against the gameplay. The mechanisms of the game are route building, resource collection, engine building, and worker placement. These are all some of my favorite mechanisms, and they're all in one game. Just based on that alone, I figured this is going to be a winner for me. You're going to be using worker placement to collect resources and activate your train, and depending on how you manage your workers on your train, you'll be able to convert the resources into track, which of course you'll need another action to actually place on the map. That sounds a bit complicated, but we'll go through it in the overview. So far this sounds like a game that's going to be right up my alley, but will this game be a sleek modern bullet train, or will it be like an old handcar that should just be left behind? Let's get it to the table, see how it's played, and we'll come back with my final thoughts on Pacific Rails Inc. So here's Pacific Rail set up for 3 players. Each player has a number of workers based on the player count, 2 train engines, 7 telegraph stations that cover up victory points, a score marker, and 11 houses. The houses are placed to cover up all but one space on your player board, and the empty space must be the leftmost spot in one of the resource sections. This uncovered spot will give you 1 extra resource of that type when taking that resource action on the main board. Each player also gets 1 of each resource: gunpowder, coin, iron, and wood, which are all placed in their cargo spots on their player board. The main board has 4 random gold cards which are used for the end of game scoring. Put out the specialists based on the number of players, and make sure all the top hats are along the top row of the Congress panel. Players, in a snake draft starting with the last player in turn order, will place 1 of their locomotives on one side of the map, starting on a city. Then, each player will place their other train on the opposite side of the board, again on a city. All of the components, hats, resources, carriage upgrades, and extra carriages are placed off to one side. Now the goal of the game is to collect the West Coast to the East Coast. As soon as that happens, the game goes into the final round. The player with the most points will win, and you're going to be getting points for laying track, placing telegraph stations, and you'll also score end of game points for how many telegraph and houses you have placed on the map, and of course the end of game scoring tiles. Let's have a quick look at your player area. Each player has their own player board which represents their train. At the start of the game, it is filled with houses and telegraph stations. There will be many ways you can remove these throughout the game. Removing houses will increase your production of resources, while telegraph stations will score you points. At the start of the game, you will not have any carriages, but you will be able to get up to 3 more carriages during the game. Each carriage will have room for 2 specialists and 3 spaces for more resources, and 1 carriage upgrade. Let's go on to the gameplay. There are 9 different districts on the main board. Around the districts are worker placement areas. On your turn, you'll either add 1 of your workers, or remove 1 of your workers from one of these worker areas, and perform the action on one of the adjacent districts. If the action has more than 1 of your workers around it, the action you take is multiplied, and I'm not going to go into all the rules of what it means, it just means that it's going to be a more powerful action. If you ever want to take an action, but all the other action spaces are occupied by other players' workers, and none of your own, you can place your worker on top of the district itself. All the other players remove their workers from around the district, and for each worker they remove, they also take a cowboy hat. But you can never have more than 2 cowboy hats. If they already have 2, they take a resource of their choice. Now cowboy hats can be used when you take a district action to act like a temporary multiplier. Treat the action strength like you have 1 additional worker adjacent to the district, then discard the cowboy hat. You can add or remove workers from the player board in any order. You do not have to place all of your workers before you remove a worker. But if you have any workers that are on a district, they must be the first worker you remove from the board. Now let's have a look at the actions. There are 4 resource actions around the board. When you choose to do an action for one of these districts, you collect the number of resources based on your player board. If all the spaces are covered for that resource on your player board, you're just going to be collecting 1 resource. You can collect all the way up to 4 resources if all 3 houses are removed from that resource. Each of these resource actions on the board also have a space for houses. If you have a house on that action, when you collect a resource, you'll collect 1 additional resource for each house that you have there. Once you have collected the resource, they must be placed on your player board in the cargo spots. If you don't have cargo spots, then you must discard resources to make room for them. Once you have collected a resource, you can optionally perform the special action connected with that resource, such as pay 1 wood to place a house from your player board onto one of the resource actions, pay gunpowder to upgrade a carriage, Pay steel to place a house onto the map in a city that is adjacent to a track tile but does not already have a railway station on it, or pay a coin to place a telegraph station in a city on the map that already has an opponent's railway station but does not already have a telegraph station. The district in the middle of the board can be used to do one of two actions, either hire a specialist or lay track, and I'm going to leave lay track until the end. But to hire a specialist, you must have an empty carriage window to place it there, and you only get carriage windows when you get your first or second or third carriage. Whenever you hire specialists, they always must be placed from left to right. So you must always fill up your carriage number 1 before you place any specialist in carriage number 2. And to hire a specialist, you must pay the cost under them based on which carriage they're going to be placed in, carriage 1, 2, or 3. The 4 other district actions allow you to activate your train. You will first activate the foreman, that is, the specialist of the district that you are activating. Each specialist will require a resource to perform their action. The miner takes gunpowder and gives you a mine track to go through mountains. The engineer takes a wood to produce bridge so you can go across water, and the crew takes steel to produce normal track to be used on the plains. The financier allows you to spend a coin to move one of the top hats down on the Congress track to get the resources or action that it covers. Or you can spend 1 coin to move all the top hats back to the top row, and for each one you do, you're going to receive a victory point. The financier action that costs more than 1 gold requires you to have multiplied the financier action, either by having more workers around the district where you're taking an action, having 2 financiers in the first carriage, or having a financier in the higher numbered carriage. Once you've activated the foreman from the district you're activating, you now run through your train from left to right, activating any carriage upgrades, then activating each specialist in order from left to right, before moving on to the next carriage. Specialists in the higher numbered carriages cost more to be initially hired, but when activated, perform their action multiplied by the number of their carriage. For example, a miner in the first carriage can convert 1 gunpowder into 1 mine track, but a miner in the second carriage can convert 2 gunpowder into 2 mine tracks. Whenever you build track with these actions, you must have room in your carriages to carry them in your cargo areas. So now that I've gone through all the other actions on the board, let's talk about the lay track action, which is the other option in the central district. With this action, you will lay track onto the board. You must start where one of your engines is, and you must build, with 1 action, track to another city to create a new route. You're going to be laying track that you've previously built and are currently storing in your cargo area. And the track that you're placing must match the terrain that you're going over. So, rails go on plains, tunnels go through hills, and bridges go over water. Cities and mountains cannot have track tile on them. After you've connected to a new city, you must either place a railway station or telegraph station. If there are no other railway stations, then you must place a railway station. Each city can only have 1 railway station and 1 telegraph station, and they must be from different players. And if this is your first railway station placed, you're going to be getting carriage number 1. With your second place railway station, you're going to get carriage number 2, and your third railway station gets you your third and final carriage. You can share a track that has already been laid, because any laid track does not belong to any player. So you can start laying track, join up with previously laid track, then branch off the previously laid track to connect to a new city. You then score your track. You look for the shortest track between the city you just connected to and any other city that it is connected to. It might not necessarily be the track that you just laid. Each new track that you laid that is part of the shortest connection is worth 2 points. All the other track you laid is only worth 1 point. You then move your engine to this new city, and any buildings of another player in a city that your train goes through will receive 3 points. The lay track is probably the most complicated piece of this game, and there are lots of examples in the rulebook of how this lay track works. I've given you a very basic overview of that action. The game ends when there's a complete railroad from one side of the board to the other. The player who placed the final track that connected the 2 sides will receive a bonus of 15 points. You then look at how many railway stations and telegraph stations you have on the map, not in the districts, and consult the chart to find out how many points you will receive. Then you look at the 4 randomly selected end-of-game scoring tiles, and the player who has the most of the requirement will receive 3 points. If there's a tie for any of these end-of-game scoring tiles, then no one gets the point. And the player with the most points is the winner. Let's get back to see what I thought about Pacific Rails Inc. So, theme and components. The theme of building a railway works as well as it does in any other railroad game I've played. You're sending in workers to get resources and hiring specialists to build you different types of track. Kind of makes thematic sense. So I'm going to say the theme works decently well in this game. So on to the components. They're a bit hit and miss in this one. The plastic minis are nice sculpts, but I'm always worried those telegraph poles are going to snap. It's very hard, rigid plastic, but so far nothing has broken, even being loose in the box. The cardboard components, the chits and the tiles, are nice, but I'm not a big fan of these player boards. I mean, they're just thick cardstock, not cardboard at all. I'm not sure why they had to be so big. All players very quickly get all 3 of their carriages as well. And with 4 players, it takes up way too much room for really what I think this game should. They could have easily shrunk these down. There's nothing on these except for the 2 spots for your specialist. Your cargo space is an upgrade. Why does this thing have to be so big? Especially when you need 3, you are going to be getting 3 more of these. But overall, I'm going to say the components are fine. On to the gameplay. The worker placement piece is probably the most interesting idea of the game. The idea of placing or removing a worker to take an action is a good mechanism. But for me, this idea that you're never locked out of a space, if there are no spots with your workers which you can remove to take the action, you can always put your worker on top of the district and send all the other workers home to be able to take that action. Although that's an interesting idea, for me it kind of defeats the purpose of the worker placement. That turn angst, the don't you dare take that action I need feeling when you're doing a normal worker placement. Now there is a little bit of that if you're trying to get an action multiplied, but the feeling is definitely lessened. I really enjoy that turn angst, that feeling that you get from normal worker placement. But if you don't, you may like this implementation better. Now, one thing I didn't go through in the overview was the multiplied effects of the different action spaces, because it seems that each type of action is slightly different when it's multiplied. For example, having multiple workers in one of the resource generating spaces mean you get 1 extra resource for each worker that you have around there. But in the same time, the special action can be done multiple times based on the number of workers you have. And having multiple workers around the higher specialists allows you to hire multiple specialists. But having multiple workers around the train activation only means you get to use the foreman multiple times, not run your train multiple times. So there seems to be an inconsistency of applying those rules. And I also do have some complaints about the game. The first is the lay track mechanism. I gave you a very brief overview for example in the overview. But in the rulebook, it's 5.5 pages long with many, many examples because it's not intuitive and really a little bit on the convoluted side. The destination city you want to go to, does it already have a short pre-existing route? If yes, and it was you who built them, then you score 2 points for a tile that you placed. But on the shortest route, if not all the tiles that are placed are yours, then you don't score the ones that aren't yours. If you move your train and you go through other cities, do those cities have other people's buildings in them? If they do, then they score 3 points. I understand what they're trying to do, but really this should have been cleaned up a bit in the rulebook and simplified. And it kind of feels the same way for many other things in the rulebook. The entire rulebook is 20 pages long and feels honestly too long for this fundamentally simple gameplay. Collect resources, hire specialist, use specialists to convert resources into track, and lay track. The organization in the rulebook is also a bit frustrating. You want to know about what the multiplying effect is in action? It's not in the actions descriptions. It's near the back of the book after the lay track examples. You learn about getting cowboy hats on page 7. It's one of the first things they tell you. But they don't tell you what the cowboy hats are actually used for until page 19. So on to the engine building mechanism, where you're hiring specialists to put in your trains from left to right and then running your train. That's fun for the first few times you run your engine. Now, I normally love engine building games, but in this game, it kind of ends up feeling repetitive. You get resources, run your engine, and lay track. Again and again and again. Now, often we complain in engine building games that you only really get a chance to run your full engine and have all your combos kick off, a few times in the game. This game has you do it so often, it kind of loses the enjoyment that I get out of engine building. The game does give you opportunity to make some good decisions. Do you want to concentrate on getting more resources during the game? Then you move your houses onto the district area of the board. And when building routes, do you want to put down a railway station to get more resources or a telegraph station to score points? You definitely want to get more houses and telegraph stations onto the map, but it's harder to do that than to get them onto the main district board, which will get you more resources. That all sounds good, but I found after several plays that it didn't seem to matter. All players kind of ended up at the same spot. No one was ever in the need of anything. We all had enough resources and specialists to build whatever track we wanted. With no random setup, the board is always the same. You always start with the same resources, and each play ended up feeling exactly like the last time. Yes, I can decide to concentrate on building mines or bridges, but I need all track types, so there's no point in specializing. I can't do anything with that extra track, so while I could try and corner the market on engineers, there felt that there was kind of no point. Everyone needs to be doing a little bit of everything. And there was little to no advantage in specializing in anything. It just feels that there's kind of one path to victory, and we're all hopped on the same train, heading the same way. Now, I feel weird about this game. I like all the individual pieces of this gameplay. The worker placement is interesting. The building up and running your train should be fun. The placing tracks gives you choices. And they should be, in theory, all working together. But, and I'm not sure why, I just didn't enjoy the game. There's nothing wrong with the individual mechanisms of the game. It just left me feeling underwhelmed. So, am I going to recommend this game? From what I just said, you probably figured I wasn't going to recommend this game. I liked all the individual pieces of this game. The worker placement mechanism, with the ability to put a worker in the district itself, is an interesting mechanism and offers some player interaction. The resource collection and engine building works just as you want it to, and the points to the key of this game is really the resource efficiency being the heart of the game. The lay track action does give you the opportunity to make some decisions on where to build and offers some opportunity for some different player interaction. And I like that the lay track functions kind of like a timer in the game. I also enjoyed that there was a random end game scoring tiles that adds a little variation to the overall gameplay. But ultimately, the game feels like a collection of good mechanisms that just don't quite come together in an enjoyable game. There are 9 districts, but since there are 4 resource collections and 4 track building actions, the actions really don't feel any different. All players need to be building all track, so there's no advantage in trying to corner the market in one type of specialist. Halfway through the game, all players seem to have enough resources and specialists to lay whatever track they wanted to, and then it was just a race to see who's going to do it first. There seems to be a very limited path to victory. How you approach the game the first time you play feels exactly the same way as the 5th time you play. Your sole purpose seemed to be resource efficiency, and without interesting mechanisms surrounding that, it just left me feeling that the game was missing something. So after all that, I'm going to give this game still a 6 out of 10. Fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with the game. Nothing in this game is a game breaker. But there's also nothing we haven't seen before. The game works, but it feels more like a collection of mechanisms we've seen before than really a cohesive, enjoyable game. And that's it for the moment. Until next time, thanks for watching.